Class. Okay, so so if you want to know why Jews do something, finding where it's located in the Talmud, is quite difficult, because imagine this is before we had electronic search of the Talmud, which we have now. Doing that required knowing the entire Talmud, and there were certainly people who had memorized entire volumes, absolutely, and were basically walking encyclopedias of Talmud. But if you wanted to like pinpoint, show me where the exact thing is that I want to know about, it's basically a fool's errand. And that's what gives rise to the entire genre of Jewish legal literature, halachic literature, is the idea that if you want to provide guides and clarifications and instructions, we need something different than the Talmud, because the Talmud is not organized in a way to actually practically instruct you on what to do and how to do it. So we looked very, very broadly at that in our first 2 weeks, that idea, and we looked at the different generations of rabbinic periods since the time of the Talmud, and those are the kind of periods that we're going to live in over the next few months. And one of the questions is, perhaps for you, where do you want to side on that debate that we looked at very briefly? Do you follow the earliest teachings, or do you follow the later teachings? And one of the things that's interesting is that people who, how do I want to say this? That the kinds of Jewish communities that tend not to strictly follow halakha, ironically, follow the principle of the earlier teachings, because what becomes the source of much of Jewish practice and knowledge is Torah, right? If you kind of default to what are the texts you're actually learning, and if you're not studying halakha, really then what you're studying is Torah and Tanakh, right? Torah and Bible. So it's a little bit of an interesting irony that many of the people who would have challenges with this principle of, we follow the earlier teachings for halachic authority, are actually defaulting to the earliest of teachings, right? The Torah and the Tanakh. But that's a little bit of a separate idea. But so that might be something to think about as we learn. What do you find more compelling, right? Or not just compelling, but what do you find more convincing or authoritative? Is it the earlier rabbinic sources that we're studying, or the ones that are more contemporary and closer to our time? That's just a little bit of a review. And now we get to jump into the actual content of what we're going to be looking at and study some text. So the topic that we're, am I going to put it up on the screen yet? I'm not going to put it up on the screen just yet. Our area of focus is this concept in Jewish practice called tzniut. I will type it into the chat. We'll see it up on the screen soon. Or depending on the community you're in, tznius, depending on how you pronounce it. I will inevitably use both interchangeably as we go along. Which, if you were to ask somebody traditionally observant today what that concept is, they would probably give you an answer that it is about kind of the laws of modest dress and presentation, and they would probably say for women is probably what they would add, and that's kind of the de facto accepted definition. This is very poor man's sociology right now, but I would bet that if you walked around to the corner and went to the bite and said, can you tell me a little bit about tzniut, you would probably get a lecture on like how women should dress. Is probably what would happen. The challenge, as I've alluded to and put in the description of our learning, is like that is very insufficient and does not actually capture the breadth of what this word is and what this practice is. And as you look at the sources and dive deeper, one of the things that you learn is that it's also seems equally applicable to everyone, regardless of sex, and that it is certainly not limited to dress at all. So then the question is, well, what's it about? What and how did it get corrupted in this way. So that's the content of our learning. One of the things we're going to discover is both like what it's actually about, which I happen to think is fascinating and applicable for everyone, regardless of where you fall on the religious spectrum, regardless of your perspectives on kind of dress and clothing and presentation, regardless of who you are. And we'll discover a little bit, like, how did that change happen? What is going on where all of a sudden it became kind of much more narrow in terms of its focus? And that's going to let us ask some really interesting questions about the evolution of Jewish law, of halakha, and of kind of egalitarianism and the role of women in Jewish life throughout history. So just a couple notes before we like literally start looking at some text today. If you want to know where the halakha of tzniut is, it's not in any one place. So if you wanted to know, like, oh, where's, if I want to know the halacha of Shabbat, where do I go to find out kind of the broad parameters of what I can and can't do and what I should and shouldn't do on Shabbat? That's pretty easy, right? We kind of know where in the major texts, where to go to, where to find it. We can organize it. It would take some time for people who were learning together earlier this year and last year. If you wanted to know where to find the laws of kashrut, we could do that, right? They're kind of concentrated in a specific place in the Talmud, and they kind of are organized systematically throughout halachic literature over time. We could do that. If you want to know where to find the halacha of tzniut, you can't. It's not in any one place. It's scattered across many different topics, meaning it's not just that it's in different places, it's that it's actually covered in different topics. You can't turn to the chapter in the classical, like certainly in the earlier rabbinic text, you just can't turn to the chapter about tzniut. You actually have to look for it across many different topics. Now, this is very frustrating, and some people might say it's disorganized, but other scholars say it's actually might be intentional as a way of demonstrating how holistic this mitzvah is, or this halacha is, and that it's not just about how women dress, that it's actually a very comprehensive area of Jewish practice that's not limited to one particular manifestation. So how do we do that then? How do we put together the idea of, well, like, what does it mean to do, or to act according to tzniut? What do we do? So it appears in at least 6 different areas, right? And we can think of them as little puzzle pieces that on their own don't give us the full picture, but as we start locking them together, we paint something much bigger. I'm mixing metaphors. We assemble the puzzle and put together a much broader picture. So the first category, and I'll type these into the chat as we go along, are like, there are general laws of halakha that relate to dignity and self-respect. There are all sorts of laws throughout rabbinic literature about human dignity and about the self-respect, which apply equally to everyone. They're not bifurcated along any sexual lines at all. So we could start looking there. We could say, well, what is the Talmud and what does rabbinic literature tell us about how we are meant to treat other people with dignity, how we are meant to treat ourselves as dignified creatures, and what are the implications of that in terms of behavior? So that's number one, is dignity and self-respect. I'm actually just going to, in case you want to follow along, I'm going to delete it, and I'm going to retype it just with a number. There we go, is the first. The second are laws related to dress. So dress does play a role, right? It's the primary way that we communicate our image outwardly, visually to the world. And in principle, this applies equally to men and women. There's, when you look at the laws in Judaism about dress, in principle, they apply equally to men and women. However, when you look at the laws of tzniut, they tend to focus specifically on women. So there's a heavier focus on women. However, the core of the laws apply equally to everyone because everybody wears clothes. So again, we see like in practice there is a distinction, but in principle there shouldn't be a distinction. And we will, when we get to this section of our learning, we will get to encounter a fascinating concept in Jewish law about, what does the role of local women's consensus play in determining the scope of halacha? What is the role of local women's consensus play? It's very interesting. The third area are laws relating to nakedness. What can you and can't you do while you're naked? In general, what halacha seems mostly concerned, and I apologize if you can hear my daughter screaming. She's probably naked and not too thrilled with it. In general, the halacha is interested in what prayers should you not say if you're naked, right? And so the texts seem to be specifically about, like, can you say the Shema while you're naked? And you're not supposed to. But we get a larger conversation here about what is and isn't appropriate in terms of your behavior around other naked people. Now, I'll say this now just to like kind of disavow the idea that Judaism is somehow like a body shaming culture, because generally it's not. Nakedness on its own is not a problem, right? Like, you can shower. There's not a problem. Like, there's no shame associated like from being in the shower or getting into bed. Like, the nakedness on its own is not a challenge. The question is, when you're in a state of nakedness, does that have an implication on what kinds of other things you can and can't do? Right. So that's the third area of laws that we would look at. I'll run through all six, and then we'll take questions.
I just had a question about nakedness quickly. Does
Sure.
nakedness mean revealing of genitalia, or could nakedness or could nakedness mean my legs are?
Great question. Stay tuned. Yeah, right. Like revealing parts of your body. Okay. Number 4 is the laws relating to inappropriate sexual behavior. Right? So the halachic literature absolutely has normative assumptions on what is and isn't appropriate. And when we look through them, that's another piece of the puzzle in determining what is this thing called sneev. Right? The 5th is an area of halacha, which I'll write in Hebrew, and then I'll translate it verbally, is an area called lifnei iver. This is the name for a general area of halacha, and it comes from literally lifnei iver means in front of a blind person, and this comes from the law in the Torah, which you might be familiar with. Don't place a stumbling block in front of a blind person, which the Torah seems to mean literally, and halacha understands it as being literal and being figurative, meaning don't cause somebody else to stumble, right? Both literally, don't trip somebody up, especially if they can't see, and also don't lead somebody else towards inappropriate behavior. And so this is a general area of halacha of like, what, if I cause somebody else to do a transgression, what responsibility do I have and what responsibility do they have? And the last category is let me just get it typed in, is the broad area of halacha called bein adam l'chavero, which means between one person and their fellow. These are just the general laws of interpersonal relations, which again apply equally to everyone. So when you look at this list, what's really interesting is that in principle, there's no distinction between sexes here at all on the list. In practice, when you zoom in on the dress one, you get more, right? That there is a focus more on what women should and shouldn't wear and can and can't wear. But in principle, there's no distinction whatsoever. And these are the 6 areas that we'll spend our time looking at and piecing together all of the different laws that come out of these into the larger puzzle of tzniut. And one of the things that I shared that we'll describe is that it's actually greater than the sum of its parts, and that we arrive at a Jewish practice, which I assume is fairly foreign or not personal to most of the people in this Zoom room, but actually might wind up being something that we're interested in learning more about, incorporating into our own lives. So that's the setup. What we're actually going to start with, even before we go through these categories, is we're going to look at the Torah. Like, where does this concept even appear not in Torah, it's not actually in the Torah, in Tanakh, in the Hebrew Bible? What does the word even mean? How do we translate it? One of the things I hope you notice is that I'm not translating the word, and that's on purpose because it's quite difficult to actually to land on a specific translation. So when that happens, when you have a word or a concept that's very difficult to translate, one of the best things to do is to look at all of the different options, really take a broad view and examine, like, where does this idea show up, and then we can start to put together our own understanding, because every translation is commentary. So that's where we're going to start. We're going to start by looking at the places in the Tanakh where this concept appears, and then how the Talmud and some of the earlier commentators, and actually some later commentators also, understand the meaning of the word tzniut. But right now, I'll pause and just give an opportunity for any questions about kind of how I've set things up and where we're going from here. Yeah, Alex.
Thank you. Good morning. I'm sorry for being late. The first four seem to be relatively consistent with the what I thought was the topic of tzniut. However, 5 and 6, Lifnei Iver ve'en Adam lechavero, look like very generic things, right? These statements could be applied to almost everything, not just what I thought was modesty type rules, right? Is there a reason for that? Is it that it expands the world of modesty, or is it what the Talmudists usually do, that start straying away from the main topic and got into those two things, so almost by accident?
Yes. So I'm actually glad that you're a little bit late, because it bears repeating. There's no one area in the Talmud or even in halachic texts until later, once things start getting compiled, where you can say, this is where I'm going to go and find all of the laws related to tzniut. It really is broad, and it does come from, like, as you say, like, very broad areas of practice. And there are some people who say that might be on purpose. Right? This is not like one specific ritual that you can just tick off the box that you do, that it's actually a very expansive orientation and way of being in the world. We don't know, right? Like, we don't know for certain. I like that. I think that's an interesting idea. In the same way that, I guess, like, this will be an imperfect analogy, but if you looked at Canadian legal codes, you could probably pull out, particularly in civil law, all the laws that are designed to create a peaceful society between people who live in the same place. As far as I know, there's no section of legal code in Canada or in Ontario on laws of nice behavior, right? Or laws of being a nice person. As far as I know, that doesn't exist. It'd be interesting to find out. But you could put it together, right? Like, you could kind of, if you wanted, you could pull all of those individual laws out and put them together and package it and say, here's how legally we try to encourage people to be nice to each other, right? Even though, as far as I know, there's no section of the law on being nice to each other. So similarly, there's no one section on tzniut where you can just pull everything out the same way like we would have for Shabbat or Kashrut or Chagim. So you really do have to pull out from all of these different areas and package them together. Okay, Sandy, and then the Springs, and then the Vandix.
So I think this is kind of a naive question, similar to Alex. Those 6 areas, are they listed specifically, or this is what these 6 are? This is what you gleaned from all your study? Do you know what I mean?
Great question. Yes. No, it's not specific. It really, it's not like if to know what the laws of Shabbat are. It's pretty easy to go and say, like, well, I know there are things that, let's talk from like a traditional halachic understanding of Shabbos. Like, there are certain acts that I can't do. There are things I'm supposed to do. There are things I'm supposed to avoid. There are all sorts of blessings that I do. There are laws around cooking, right? We know those things, and it's very systematic and itemized consistently. It's not true for this. So you do have to, as an observer of this, kind of look broadly. And I think this will become clearer as we really dive in, and you'll start to see how really from the get-go, as soon as you start looking at some of the core texts in this area, you notice that it's pulling from each of these. But it's an interesting question. Was it intentional or not? We'll never know, right? But it will tell you something about, if you're the kind of person who says it's not intentional, and that it's just a kind of a fluke or an accident, then that makes it much easier to say, well, it's not really about kind of a holistic approach to how we act with each other. It's just it just is. But if you look at this and say, no, it does seem very intentional that it's drawing from a broad range of areas of Jewish practice, that might encourage you. And here I am absolutely telegraphing my opinion on this, like, oh, this really does have to do, like, not just with the clothes I wear or tell women that they can't wear, and much more with a broad way of acting. I'm not translating the word yet, but of acting with tzniut in the world. Great question. Yeah, Larry or Mindy?
We get caught up, many of us get caught up in the minutiae, the details of how to dress, for instance. If you go to different Orthodox shuls, they expect a different length of skirt for the women. They expect the sleeves can maybe be 3/4 in some shuls and should be all the way in others. I was standing outside the Pride of Israel one Saturday after services, ready to take a bus home because that's my state of mind. And this young couple walks down the street from the Orthodox shul, and the young lady is dressed, quote, appropriately. Her skirt is the right length, but ridiculously tight. Her sweater is covering, or I think it was even a turtleneck, so even covering her neck, but again, leaving nothing to the imagination. And I'm looking at her, and instead of being turned off by the way she looks, which is kind of the plan, I'm looking and saying, very nice, thank you. So it's the details can sometimes get a little corrupted.
So it's a similar observation to the question that Sandy asked. If it's just about ticking the boxes, are you actually missing the point? Right. That's one way of thinking of what we're learning at. And I would say, and again, here I'm absolutely telegraphing us, because of how it seems to be presented, I think that this area of practice and thought is not just about ticking the boxes. That is an element of saying, of like helping you understand, like, what, where are the parameters around this? But it's not as simple as saying, well, this is or isn't kosher, right? It's much more broad. Yeah, and I think we will encounter, I imagine, lots of illustrative examples of things that we have seen or wonder about. Yeah. Okay, Vanix, and then we're going to hop in and study some text.
I guess a jumping off point from both what Alex said and what Larry said. We have on many occasions been told or been taught, not sure what the correct word is, that you don't make a rule unless somebody's already broken. In other words, you gotta have a reason for having this rule. In other words, don't go through a red light, because if you do, you're gonna have an accident. Well, how do we know that? Because somebody went through what ought to have been a red light,
right,
and had an accident.
Yeah.
So I guess the question comes down to this. What is the modus operandi behind this what appears to be a very complex system of right and wrong?
Yeah.
Because, because as you said earlier, it encompasses everything.
What is the MO? Right, great. I'm not going to answer that. I think you should write this down, or I'll write it down, and let's come back to it in a few months and see if we can figure it out. Because again, the question reveals the nature of the learning. It's not like other things that we've learned. Yeah, right. It's not like other things that we've learned where you could see the objective immediately right from the outset. It's not clear from where we're sitting right now. And I acknowledge this is perhaps very frustrating for you. Maybe you're saying like, well, I thought this was going to be a class on modesty, and I wanted to learn about that. Okay, well, it will be. But there is, like, from the outset, the immediate objectives aren't readily clear. And as I've teased, and hopefully it's igniting a little bit of a mystery, it seems that something has changed very recently in history, where it has become much more of this kind of hyper-conservative, restrictive, particularly only to women. And when you look back at the original sources, that doesn't seem to be the case. So what happened? What changed? Okay, great. Hopefully that ignites a little bit of mystery. Peter's question is a great one. What's the MO of all of this? What's the point of all of this? That will reveal itself over time. And I'm sure lots of us will disagree on that. I have no doubt. Okay, so as I shared, I promised that I will send out this this text package afterwards. I'm going to the way I've thought about this is because hopefully you get the sense right now of just how expansive this is. I'm not giving, as I've done in the past, all of the texts right at the beginning. It would be too much. It would just be so much. And I'm doing this as a favor to myself, because I imagine that as we go, things are going to shift and we'll want to look at kind of different pieces. So I'm going to give it in like chapter or parts, right? So part one is really looking at, what does this word even mean? What does the word itself, tsniut, even mean? How, as I said, like, the way you translate it is itself a commentary. So I'm just going to throw out some options which other people use, which if you search for online, perhaps you'll hear it. So here are some options. Modesty is absolutely the most common. Maybe it means dignity. Maybe it means privacy. Maybe it means humility. Maybe it means discretion. Maybe it means simplicity. Maybe it means decency or prudency or secrecy. Right? Modesty, dignity, privacy, secrecy, simplicity, prudence. All of there's relationships between these. We could overlap them, but they all have distinct meanings. And how you choose to translate the word tells you a lot about how you understand what it's actually talking about.
Can you make that a little larger, please?
Yes, I can make it larger. How's that? So the tsniut is the kind of well, we're not going to do a whole lot of Hebrew grammar here, but so tsanua and tsniut, it's the same words. They refer to the same concept. They're just in different kind of conjugations. One is the gerund, if you're interested in grammar. So how do we define tsniut or tsanua? Well, it appears in Tanakh twice, only twice. In the entire Hebrew Bible, the word or any version of it only appears twice. The first is very famous passage from Micha, from the prophet Micah. Who would like to read us off? English is fine with this first text.
Sure, I can read.
Great, thanks, Sandy.
You have been told, O mortal, what is good and what Adonai requires of you, only to do justice and to love goodness, and to walk tzneia, JPS modestly, with your God. Okay,
I shouldn't have put this in. I was going to ask people, how have you heard this translated before? I cheated. I'm sorry. So what I will do is I pull in these different sources. I'll often leave it untranslated. And great, John. So John, you've heard another translation of this as humbly. Yeah, that's definitely one that I've heard before. But the word is to walk tsneia, like with tsniut, right? With tznius, that you should walk with tznius. So JPS, the commentary from JPS says another way of translating that is, it is prudent to serve your God. That's a kind of a different understanding, right? one is that you should walk modestly, and another one says that like it would be good if you would serve God. The New International Version, which is a Christian translation, says to walk prudently with God. But even that is different, right? Saying it is prudent to serve your God is different from saying walk prudently with your God. And this translation, this Christian translation, gets it from the book of Mishle, the book of Proverbs, which is the other place where this word appears. And we'll take a look at that later. So right off the bat, even just in the first time this appears in Tanakh, it's not entirely clear what this means. Like, we could probably have a little bit clearer answers on what it means to osei mishpat, to do justice, right? Might be a little bit easier. And to love goodness is not a great, it says to love chesed, right? So to love kind of the interpersonal acts of obligation, of loving kindness that we do towards each other. But what does it mean to walk with sneah? Mom, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, just a couple things strike me is that, the word sneah is there not accidentally. I mean, theoretically, you could say, and to walk with your God.
Oh, great. Okay, good. Good observation.
So there's obviously a call to walk in a certain way with God. So there's a way to be when you are with God. And also, I think it's got to be really important that justice and goodness or chesed are the other two things that you're doing, that you're engaging in. So if they can kind of happen, like walking in a certain way with God could be because you're doing justice, because you're loving.
Okay, great. So so Mom, you've made two excellent observations. One is sneah here is modifying walk in a way that the other two things on the list don't have that adverb or adjective, depending on how we translate it, right? It doesn't tell us how to do justice, and it doesn't tell us how to feel about chesed, but it does tell us how we're meant to walk with God. And you asked like it's a great Talmudic question, like, well, why couldn't you just say to walk with God, right? Like, you could say that, and that's like absolutely a concept that exists in rabbinic texts. So that would lend it more importance because it seems to be there on purpose. And you asked another great question, and that's, are these three separate things? Are they three different discrete acts? Or does walking with sneah say something about the first two things? Great questions. Dawn.
In terms of the translations that were given here, I think they mean different things. Like, I'm not convinced modestly, prudently, or humbly are the same things. And
I think you're right.
And I think that we have to be careful in how we translate sneah, even though sneah is almost not translatable in this way, because if I am humble, that doesn't necessarily mean I'm modest, right? If I am prudent, that doesn't necessarily mean I'm humble. So it's a very complicated way of translation. Yeah. And sometimes translations are not always the best way to approach something. And I think in this case, that's the problem we're having.
So right off the bat, like, we're not even in the halacha of this. We're just looking at where the word appears for one of the first times in our texts. And it's not clear what it means, right? It's very clear when it says, Higid lecha adam, right? You have been told, humans. There's not really any debate over like what those words mean, right? Because they're concrete terms. But sneah is abstract, and we don't immediately on its own know what it means. The springs and then the vents.
It strikes me, one word I might use, although it scares me a little bit, is properly, because then that word sort of kind of conjures up all sorts of rules again, which are not necessarily where I want to go. But I remember as a kid going to shul on a Shabbat, and some of the wealthier women would come in halfway through the service and make a big deal about taking off their mink stoles. And even as a kid, I said, that is so wrong. We're in shul, we shouldn't be, it's not about that. Again, is it a hard and fast rule? No. Do I want to see it written in stone? No, but there's a proper way to act in public.
Yeah. So maybe what we can say that is clear from this is that it seems to be it's a positive thing, right? Like it's not negative, right? Do justice, love goodness, and walk this way with God. It's certainly not a negative concept, right? It seems to be positive. So yeah, we can narrow down the options of what it particularly means. Vanix, and then Mom, if your hand is still up from before.
I'm almost of the opinion that you could leave out the word entirely, because the way in which you're supposed to walk with God is almost defined by the first two: love, justice and goodness.
Right.
So why even have it there? And I know there's no answer to that question.
No, there is, absolutely. And that was the question that that Mom, you asked, was it seems extraneous. And so this should be igniting your Talmudic minds, that when you have something that seems extra and unnecessary, you know that there's going to be a question of like, well, why is it there? Yeah. So is it extra? Mom, is your hand up from before?
No, this is new. Excuse me. This is obviously a very familiar passage. You see it a lot, and it reminds me of the Hillel thing. Love your neighbor as yourself. The rest is commentary. That this kind of encapsulates what human behavior should be at its best.
Yeah. It's kind of like, well, first of all, it's one of the top hits, right? It's right up there with exactly as you said. This is one of the biggies that's very popular, and for a reason, right? Like whoever authored this text constructed it in such a way so that it would become one of the big hits, right? You can tell by the way it's written. It's written as a list of 3 things. Is it escalating? Are they related to it? We're not going to do a whole class on biblical literature, but like it's very clearly meant to be like that. And then the question is like, how does it become like a meta principle, or is it something specific, a specific set of behavior?
Yeah, it's interesting. So this is in Micha. We have the whole Torah before this, which expounds on, what doing justice and loving goodness is. There's tons of stuff about that in Torah. This boils it down to one kind of touchstone phrase, and then the rabbis go like this again with it.
Yeah, it's like an hourglass. Yeah. And in fact, I will give you a teaser. There is a piece of Gemara. There's a Talmud that it says exactly what you're saying right now, Mom. That's saying like, what are the if I wanted to summarize the entire Torah in one verse, what verse would it be? And this is one of the options that they give, because it feels like this kind of meta principle that can encapsulate everything. But then, of course, if you want to know, but it doesn't actually tell me what to do, then you have to zoom back out, right? So it's a great slogan, right? It's a very good slogan. And your assessment of it is something that the Talmud does exactly. Don, you have asked an interesting question, then we'll go to Sandy. Whenever this text was written, might they have known exactly what it meant? Might it have been a little bit more concrete? Maybe. The way that we would answer that is by looking everywhere else it appears, right? That's how you kind of figure out what words mean. Our challenge is that it only appears in one other place in Tanakh. It only appears twice. So then we're like, okay, well then let's look at rabbinic text. And that's what we're doing, right? So I would say by the end of part 1, we will have looked at a lot of different commentary and interpretation of this word. And maybe at the end of that, we'll have a sense of what is consistent. Sandy.
Thanks. So I'm just looking for your comment maybe on something I put in the chat that occurred to me that maybe the translation might be in service. And where I was thinking of that was coming from just our sense of being chosen and that high degree of responsibility.
Mm-hmm.
If we have such a high degree of responsibility, then being in service is doing all those
Yeah,
good and
that's
moral
lovely.
things.
That's lovely. I mean, grammatically, it doesn't seem to be.
Thank you.
That we know, like, we know what the word for that is. It's avodah, right, which means work, but also means like kind of like sacrificial work and labor towards God. But philosophically, I think you're spot on in the same way that other people have said it. Was like it's talking about how you should act towards God, and there seems to be a positive value associated with it, of like service or the particular relationship we are meant to have with God, because it doesn't just say walk with God, it tells you how you're supposed to do that, and we can assume that it's positive. And so there does seem to be like a relational aspect to it right there. Okay, I'm cheating, Alex, and then we're gonna look at some more text.
Yeah, just a quick comment, maybe a bit of a contrarian view. The three things that are required from a person are, although it's short and sweet and could do well for a slogan, actually can be interpreted differently because the exact meaning of each of the words not only changes over time, but changes from person to person. Right, a few hundred years after Micah, Socrates was debating what does it mean when we talk about a particular concept, right? Like valor, or whatever, all the words that he was challenging our understanding about. And what is to do justice, right? That is contextual, and the answer is going to change from human to human. Similar loving kindness, and probably the Hatznea will be the possibly the same thing. And even the word walk could actually be subject to dissection. And
there was a very beautiful and famous Gemara that says, what do you mean walk with God? How can you possibly walk with God, right? That's not possible. And then it says, because whenever God is referred to as walking in the Tanakh, it says like God is walking in fire and storm. And the rabbis say, no. It's a metaphor, and it means to be kind and to clothe the naked and to care for the sick and to bury the dead, right? Is what. So there is already this concept
that's an interpretation. It's an interpretation for that particular rabbi, right?
Great. It's where the literal gets like, does it literally mean why? I don't know. Okay, so great. Okay, so let's see like what some of these interpretations are. So let's start with Rashi, which is as good a place as any to start. Rashi is an 11th century commentator. He's from France. And I introduced him last week as he's one of the Rishonim. He's one of the earlier periods of rabbis and commentators. And Rashi is famous for many things, but particularly for his line-by-line commentary on pretty much the entire Tanakh and Talmud. And his project is he's looking around at the illiteracy in Ashkenazi Europe in the medieval period, and he's saying people literally don't know what the text means, and his goal is to explain to people on a very kind of literal level what words and concepts mean. So he's a great place for us to start. So this is what Rashi says about this passage. And Alex, since you were the last to talk about like what does this literally mean, why don't you go and read Rashi here for us?
And to walk Snea. Targum Yonatan renders, walk discreetly in the fear of your God. Another explanation, and walk discreetly means the standard of flesh and blood is not like the standard of the Holy Blessed One. The standard of flesh and blood is, if one embarrasses his fellow and comes to placate him, the fellow says to him, I will not accept your apology until so and so, and so and so, before whom you disgrace me, come. But the Holy Blessed One desires only that the man's return to him be between the two of them.
Okay, so Rashi's doing something interesting here. Rashi, when he makes his arguments and his definitions and his opinions, he draws from other sources. So here he's drawing from two sources. The last one, this Pesikta de Rav Kahana, is a collection of Midrash. It's a very early collection of Midrash. And Targum Yonatan is the Aramaic translation of prophets, of Nevi'im. During the exile, once Jews are exiled out of the land of Israel, what would happen in shul, when they were reading the Torah or they were reading Haftarah, they would do a live simulcast translation. You can think of it like the UN, where everybody has like the little things on their ears. So if you were to go to a shul, if you were to walk into a synagogue in like the 1st century in Babylonia, you would hear a live translation line by line from Hebrew into Aramaic, because people lost their understanding of Hebrew, but they knew Aramaic, right? So we know that this is very old, as early as the 4th century. Targum Yonatan, which means Jonathan's translation, was accepted as authoritative, as like it was like the JPS of the 4th century. It was kind of the accepted standard translation. And today, even today, if you go to a Yemenite shul, you will hear Targum Yonatan in Aramaic read line by line. So if you I don't know if there's any in Toronto, but if you were to go to like a Yemenite shul in Israel, when they read Haftarah, line by line, you'll hear Targum Yonatan read, the Aramaic translation. Well, that's a community to this day that still does that. So these are the two texts that Rashi is drawing on, and he's trying to do what we're trying to do. It's like, well, what does this word really mean? So the Targum Yonatan one is a bit easier because he's just quoting a translation, and again, we're now looking at a translation of a translation, but he says, walk discreetly, right? And fear here is not like scary fear, it's like awe, right? Or like the awesome grandeur and power. But what does that even mean? Like, what is discreetly? So Rashi himself seems to understand that just giving you a literal translation into another language isn't going to help. He says, he anticipates the question, like, well, what does discreetly mean? So what's his point? What's this kind of comparison, this midrash he brings of saying like, well, people aren't like God, right? He says the standard of flesh and blood is not like the standard of the Kadosh Baruch Hu. He's saying the way that humans act is different from the way that God acts. And what are the two kind of standards that he lays out here? What's the human kind of the way, the kind of his comment on human behavior?
It's more about the public. Well, the example that gives on the apology is it's not just with me that you erred, but all the damage that you caused, with the people surrounding me. Whereas with God, it's just between you and God. It's more personal. Yeah.
So, but even go kind of like another layer, and he has almost like a little bit of like a negative view of humans, right? Of saying, if I wrong someone, it's actually specifically if I embarrass someone, and then I come back. Actually, let me flip it. If somebody embarrasses me, and that person comes and to apologize to me, to placate me, he thinks that, like many people say, like, I'm not going to accept your apology until everybody who saw what you did to me comes, right? So but with God, if we wrong God, if I embarrass God, does God say, Jesse, I'm not going to accept your apology until you publicly renounce what you did in front of everybody who saw? No, it's between me and God, right? God doesn't seem to need the ego stroking in this. What do you make of that distinction? Why do you think he's bringing this?
I'm thinking possibly that your relationship with God is it's just one-on-one. Doesn't matter. No one else has to know what your relationship is with God. It's just private. But we live in a society, so the other thing is it's more public. It has to be if you've hurt somebody or taken their land or embarrassed them, it's not just between the two of you. It's a society thing.
And there seems to be like almost like an implicit moral judgment there. Like, we kind of should be treating each other the same way we relate to God, or that God treats us, but we don't, right? Kind of, we mess up all the time, right? Does that help us understand discreet, and like why discreet is the translation that's offered there, both in Aramaic and in English? Of it's this idea of like, you have, Gita, as you said, like, your relationship with God is discreet. It doesn't need to be about kind of everybody else. It's just between you and God. Whereas our relationships with humans tend to be much more in the public eye. So now let's take that. Let's see what Rashi's doing, right? He's given us a translation, then he's given us a little bit of an interpretation. Now let's project that back onto the text. What does it mean to walk tzne'ah with God? How would, like, what does that mean now in translation, or in our interpretation? How would you approach it? Carla, yeah.
Can I say, make your choices in the paths that you choose?
Oh, cool. Yeah, say more about where that's coming from.
Two roads diverged in a yellow wood, and
Great.
sorry I could not travel both.
Cool, yeah. And you're saying that, like, when you walk, make sure you walk in the right direction?
Yeah, you pick because I mean, everything you do in your life is you're making a choice. At each stage, at each step, you make dozens of choices a day. They're micro choices. But like, so you're always, as you go on the path of your life, you're making choices that are.
Do you know what I love about where, and tell me if this is what you're intended. I thought you're describing like acting with discretion, right? Like, make sure you act with discretion. And that's, the same word, right? Like, it's about a private thing between you and God. It's discreet, but we get the same concept of when you make choices, make sure you're making them kind of thoughtfully and intentionally. I love it. I love it. It's great. Mom, your hand is up.
Yeah, going back to the whole passage from Micha, now you can see that it's about your two categories of relationship: your relationship with other humans and your relationship with God. And this is not the only place we see this. This is a big part of Yom Kippur and Cheshbon HaNefesh, is making right the things that are bein adam lechavero, in public with other people, and then
Nice.
in making right your transgressions against God, bein adam lemakom, right? Your transgressions against God.
Great. So there's
and that latter category is something that you do in your heart, in your prayers, but within yourself.
Great. Okay, so I'm going to let you keep going. We are running short on time. Mom, will you read from the next text from Radak?
Sure.
Radak is the acronym for the Rabbi named David Kimchi, not kimchi, as some people like to say, but Kimchi. He lives a generation after Rashi in the 12th and 13th centuries in France. He is a commentator and a philosopher, but one of the things he's really interested in is grammar, and he explains words on the basis of their etymology and their grammar. And he's very, very influenced by the Rambam, by Maimonides. And another thing that, two things that he's famous for, interestingly, in the course of his life are, he publicly debates Christians and Christian interpretation of the Tanakh, but later, his grammatical interpretations formed the basis of a lot of the King James version of the Bible. So he occupies like a really interesting place there. Mom, read what Radak says, and that'll be our last text of the day.
And to walk tzneah, this refers to the unity and love of God with all one's heart and with all one's soul. It uses the expression v'hatzneah, since such matters are given over to the heart in a private tsanua place.
Okay. So we started off with Rashi's interpretation, which people said, well, it's about you and this relationship that you have with God, and it doesn't have to be in the public eye. But we weren't necessarily talking about privacy. We were talking about discretion, right? And Radak adds a different bit of a layer here and says, whatever it is to walk with God, it's It is specifically about something that is private to you, which, Mom, you also said, right? It's about kind of your personal, in your heart relationship of the work that you need to do. So read that back onto the text. What does it mean to walk with God, with tsanua? Right? You can start layering on these kind of different interpretations to the text in this way. So I know we only got through two commentators this morning, but it's great. We'll go right in. But hopefully one of the things we should already see is just looking at the core of this concept and where it comes from in our tradition. It's not immediately clear, so we've got a little bit of a mystery that we have to do some uncovering here. And slowly we'll build these layers and we'll build these layers. Or you can look at it the other way. We'll dig through layers. And we'll hopefully come out on the other side with an understanding of what the prophet was talking about when he said, walk with Sneha. So keep an eye on your inboxes, your email inboxes. I will send out the collection of source text. I will send out a PDF of the presentation from last week if you want to look at the different rabbinic periods. And we'll see everybody next week. Have a great day, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jesse.
Thanks all.